Should I start? Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Martin Gontovnicas. My Twitter handle is mgonto. You can follow me if you want to increase my ego. And today we'll be talking about how to create good documentation. So it always seems kind of boring, documentation. So are you guys ready to learn about documentation? Awesome. See, we're spiking things up. So let me start first with a little introduction about myself. So I'm a software developer from Buenos Aires, Argentina. That means that I traveled like 15 hours to get here. Thankfully, I could sleep because it's like too fucking long. And I work at OutZero. I will tell you a little bit more about OutZero later on. And the important thing is that I used to be coding JavaScript all day long. So this used to be me all day long. Like I was like a machine coding, touching the keyboard and putting new features and things like that. But recently I've changed a little bit, and now I work as a developer advocate. I wish I were working with Al Pacino because I love him, but unfortunately I'm not. So when I say that I am a developer advocate, a lot of people think that I do this, that it's all like smoke and mirrors and just like talk smoke, but I do code. Trust me, I still code. Not all day, but I do code. So let's dive into the talk. Let's start with the talk. I also love Jim Carrey. So let's start with one fact. Creating documentation is really hard. And why is that? Because when we're writing something, we usually write it on how we think that it should be understood, on how we think people will understand it. But the thing is that we don't use empathy, and we don't put ourselves in a position of somebody else. And something that is even more important is that creating good documentation for developers is even harder. Because a developer is like a really, really, really hard public. Because we like to read prose. I mean, if you give me a blog post that is all prose, I won't read it. That's for sure. Just give me a few texts, code, let me make it easy to copy and paste or something like that, and that's it. So writing good documentation for developers is even harder. And that's what I'm going to try to explain today. Like, what are the different things that I've learned by working and creating documentation for developers? So the question that we're going to answer is, how do we do it? But first, before answering that question, we should start from the beginning. And the beginning is, how is a day in a developer life? So if we're writing something for a developer, we must understand what a developer does in his day and how we can make it easy for him to read something and be able to use it. So how's a day in a developer life? This is how my ex-girlfriend used to think that I was doing, because in my company I had a ping pong, I had a foosball, so she thought I was playing all day long and that's it. I really love this XKCD joke where, yeah, I'm compiling and you're doing like sword fighting or something like that. And this is not really what we do all day long. There's another joke which is a little bit more similar to the truth, where we're always near the computer. I mean, I don't know, I'm buying a sandwich, I'm ordering something, I'm reading, everything I'm doing, I'm always with the computer. And even when I'm dreaming, I'm with the computer. At least for me, a lot of time has happened that I was having like a really, really, really hard problem, and I was trying to crack it, and I didn't know how to do it. But then I went to sleep, and once I woke up, wow, now I know how, because my brain was like clean, I don't know. So even when I sleep, I'm thinking problems about a developer. But what is the most important feature that I think that a developer should have? Know how to Google search. I think I'm like 60% of my day doing Google search. I love Google search. So you always have to know the right words to put in Google, because that's what I do. I Google search, I use the code from there. I honestly don't know how people used to code before Google existed, or before they could just compile or anything every time. That's really hard. So let's imagine now that I want to use something. So I'm using, I don't know, Node.js project, and I'm using Express, and I want to do a redirect. So I don't want to implement it myself. So what I would do is I would search redirect express npm on Google, and then click on the result. And once I find that the result, I would read the README really, really, really fast to see if that works or not. So once I find that result, I would say, okay, let's see if it works. And what I would do is select the code, copy, and then go to Sublime and paste. And then just click on run. And hope that it runs, because if it runs, that's it. That means that's it. Now I have redirect. I didn't have to do anything else. I just Googled, I find the result, I didn't read anything, I copied and pasted, and wow, it just works. But what happens when that doesn't happen, when I just like copy paste and it doesn't work? Then I go to look to examples, because when I copy and paste some code from a documentation, I know that the documentation doesn't compile, it's just text. So it can have errors, it can have a lot of things. But an example runs. So what I would do is I would download the example, and then I would run that example and see how it works. And once I see it works, I would copy it from there. Now, I have the example running, I copy it to my code. Shit, it still doesn't work. What do I do in that case? In that case, I go back again to my first beloved tool, which is Google. But now I Google for a Stack Overflow question, because somebody else must have had the same problem. I mean, I can't be the only one with that problem. And I try to look at it, and what if I don't find a Stack Overflow question? That means that I have to create a Stack Overflow questions. I think I've done that like very, very few times in my life, and once I did that, I never get a response soon. So once I have to create a Stack Overflow questions, this is my face. I'm like really, really mad, because it means I Googled for the code, I copied the code, it didn't work. I downloaded the sample, I copied the code for the sample, it didn't work. I looked for Stack Overflow for the solution, I copied that solution, it didn't work. So what does that mean? Again, I have to code now. And if I am a nice person, what that means is that I will code the solution and then open source it, so that if there's somebody else like me gets that problem, then he can just use that same solution. That's at least how most of my open source projects have been created. I've tried to find something, I didn't find it, I coded it, and I say, yeah, I coded it. Let's make it easy for other person to not have that same problem. So at least that's what I think that the developer journey is throughout the entire day. And everything is Google or search focused, because what is something that is important is that if you're doing like a product or an open source project for developers, I think that it's really mandatory to understand the developer and to know what that developer really wants. And something that is like the most important thing is that the developer, why is he always Googling? Because what he wants to code, what he wants to add to the project is something that adds value. So imagine that you're doing, I don't know, a new application, and you want to have logging which is distributed, but your application doesn't depend on that logging. You just want it because it's easy to log something, but it's something that is collateral to your application. Everything that is collateral to your application, the idea would be that you would actually search for it or find a tool that already exists. So every open source library or product that is being made should avoid the developer having to code something that doesn't add value to what he's doing. And every time you're doing something, it has like one core value or one main value, and then the rest of the things help you out. And that's basically what we have been doing at Auth0. Auth0 is basically a SaaS that helps you with authentication authorization. So the idea is that you hook it up to your app or API, and with a couple lines of code, you get authentication working. And the idea is that most apps have authentication, but that's not the core. I mean, you want the user to log in, you want to get the user information, but then you want to do something with that information and maybe create a new application or whatever you need, but that's something that he needs to have, but that doesn't add value. And the important part of what I've just said is that we try to make the developer use it with a couple lines of code and make it really easy for the developer to use our product. Because if it's hard, or if the documentation isn't clear, or if what he's doing, he can't find it, that means that the product doesn't work. It doesn't give anything to that developer. And the same if it would be an open source project. I mean, if you're trying to accomplish something, to give something to the user, and it's not clear how to use it, then it doesn't work. So this is what we've learned so far when trying to work to make it easy for the developer to implement our tool. These are like the 8 different things that I'm going to be speaking about. I will go one by one right now. So let's start with the first one. So the first one is tailored documentation. What does it mean? Well, it means copy-paste friendly. As I was saying, the developer always wants to copy-paste code. And imagine you're making a product. If you're making a product, that means that he's probably going to have to put in the code some, I don't know, client ID or user ID or secret or whatever. And then there are a lot of products that have the documentation that says client ID, put your client ID here. User ID, put your user ID here. And developers don't read. So I copy and paste and run, it doesn't work. And why? Because below that, it said, yeah, and you need to change your user ID for that user ID. It seems dumb, but we had a lot of questions of people saying, hey, we copied this and it doesn't work, and they just didn't see that. So if it's easy, why not just actually show that? In this case, I'm logged in with my conferences account, and the copy-pastable snippet that you see here has the client ID and client secret for that. So once he copies this and pastes it, it will work. And one step further of this is to also have tailored sample projects. Because, as I was saying, when you're creating documentation, that doesn't compile. And sometimes you copy-paste that, and it doesn't work. So you should have samples that the user can download. And if those samples also need configuration for the user, like, as I was saying, user ID or whatever, you should let the user actually download that sample with those keys. So let's actually see it live. In our documentation, we have this download seed project, for example, which once you click on it, it will download the file. And once you unzip that file that you get, you will see that in this case, it has a .m file, which has all the configuration for the client ID, client secret, etc. And the nice thing about it is that this example that you're downloading here is actually on GitHub. Because another thing that we developers love is GitHub. So if you're going to have a sample only on your documentation page, well, it won't work because a lot of people won't find it. So you always have to have that sample in GitHub. And of course, as we are developers, we like the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. So we won't create the sample twice. So what we are doing is creating the sample once in GitHub. In this case, you will see that it's in Node.0 repository under the examples folder. And the nice thing is that if you read the README, what it will say is, OK, if you want to run this example, the only thing you got to do is create that .m file and put all your keys from Auth0. So if you download this sample from our documentation, it will have all the keys already configured. But if you get here from GitHub, it will say, OK, now create that .m that was actually created automatically in the other way, and use that, and then you will be able to run it. And this sample is actually sitting here on GitHub. And the nice thing about this is that you can do this same thing that we are doing yourself. We've open sourced a library called Configure Sample Generator, and what it does is it lets you grab a sample project from GitHub, add whatever configuration that you want, and then send it back to the client. So let's see really quickly how we can actually make it work. And what you would do is you have this Packer configurer, and there are two important parts in this. First, you need to configure the information loader, which is this one. And the information loader, what it will do is it will connect to your database or to whatever you want and get all the information that will be tailored for that user. In this case, for example, I'm getting the secret from the DB, and then I'm setting that in the context. The context is like that bag of cats that will get sent then to the user once it's configured. And then we have these type processors. A type processor is what is going to actually save that information that you have into the sample project. We know that there are different type of sample projects, so you can create different type of type processors. For example, the server one in this case, what it does is it creates that .m file, which is usually used in a server project. But we also have one which lets you create like a JavaScript file for a front-end project. And then we have, for example, in this case, this file replacer, where if you're doing a project, what it will do is it will search for the bracket client ID or bracket client secret, and then replace it for whatever information you have loaded. And once you have configured this, then you can just use it. And for that, you will instantiate this Packer object, and you will specify which repository from GitHub it will use, which branch it will use. You will say the example path, because at least in our case, we always have the SDK, which is like the repository on GitHub, and then inside there, we have the examples folder. So what he would download is an example inside that repository. Once you have that, in this case, he's specifying the sample type, which in this case is server, so that means that this will create the .m file. And then this context information is like the initial information to create, to get all of this custom information. In this case, it's getting the client ID from the request. Once that's done, we just call this create, and that will return to us the stream, which is like the zip file, which was created for that sample with all that information for the user. And then you can just pipe it to the response or send it to the response, and the user will then get that zip file already configured. And for example, how we are using this, what we're doing is you're going to auth0.com/docs, and then all of the properties that you see here that are hard-coded in the Packer, we're actually sending them as part of the URL so that you can create whatever package. So in this case, what it's saying is, OK, it will download the sample from the Node.0 repository from the master branch. The the example is in the example Node.js API path. This will be a type server, which means that it will create a .env, and then this is the extra information that you need to load everything. So if this would be an, I don't know, an Angular example, in this case it would be like Angular Auth0, master, create package, blah, blah, blah. And the main idea is that then we have created this little tool that all it does is it receives all the parameters from the requests, sends it back to the packer, and then calls this packer.create, and that's it. It just works for us. And of course, we're using this open source library that we have created. And that way, it's really easy to create these sample projects that are already configured for your user to use. Another thing that is really important is embeddable documentation. What does it mean? Again, documentation should be everywhere. As I was saying, people will get to your documentation from a lot of different places. Some people might get from GitHub because they are looking on GitHub and they find it there. Some people might find it on the documentation public page from your product or your open source project, or some might actually log in to your product and they want to see the documentation inside there. So that means that there are a lot of points where the user might want to see a documentation. And we don't want to be linking the user around so that he goes from one place to another. But again, we don't want to repeat ourselves again. We don't want to write the documentation more than once. So the solution that we have found for that is actually writing the documentation on Markdown on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/auth0/docs, you will see that all of our documentation is written on Markdown. So what you see here is like a regular Markdown, which has this link to download a sample project, and then it has like the code and the different regular things that you have it. And then that same project, what it does is it renders that Markdown using MarkDocs anywhere, and it's embeddable everywhere. So the documentation that you see here, even though it's styled, it's the same Markdown that is on GitHub. You will see that it says this download seed project with your keys already configured, which is exactly what it says here. So what we are rendering is exactly what is on GitHub. And this that is rendered here is just using MarkDocs, which is an NPM library. And again, this is like the docs public page from Auth0, but then if the user is logged in, as in this case, then you can also see that same documentation inside there. Because if you're already logged in and you say, okay, I want to log in with Facebook and Twitter, and now, okay, how do I implement my Node.js app? And then you can just see it in there. We don't have to link you to like the public page or whatever. And you can see it in here really fast. And another thing that we use to make this documentation be easy to use and available everywhere is this Lodash templating. Basically what we're doing is, Lodash is like very similar to underscore, and it has like a very minimal templating library. And what we're doing is, we're adding a plugin to MarkDocs, which actually lets you template that Markdown and add ifs and fors and things like that, so that the Markdown itself can get information from the context, which in our case is the session, and then based on that, show one thing or another. I will just show it live in a second, but one example for us is that imagine you're creating like a single page app with jQuery. And then that single page app that you're creating can have two different types of APIs. One is like an API that you made like Node.js. Another one is an API that you're using, a third-party API like Firebase. So all the documentation in our case is exactly the same, except for one step, which will differ if you're using your API or a third party. So instead of writing the whole document again, what we're doing is we're adding an if there, and it will show one section or the other depending on a session variable. So let's see it live. We have this Lodash_true here. And then first you will see that we have an if saying, okay, this is a third party, and it will show a different sample based on that. And then if we go a little bit down, you will see that the step 4 is 2 times, configuring a call to third-party API, and then you will see the fourth step again, configuring call to your API. And above that, there was an if and an else, which was checking the session variables to see, okay, what type of application is the user creating? And based on that, showing something. And also, we are using that same Lodash templating to create that tailored documentation that I've shown before. So once it goes up again, what you will see is that we're using like context.clientID or context.clientSecret, and that will be the one that is actually showing the user information in that case. And the last thing I want to say about like having the docs everywhere is that a lot of people will have errors in the documentation. I mean, I am very typo friendly. I always have typos. So if you can get people to actually help you with the documentation and things like that, it's really amazing, because instead of creating like a support ticket, what we are doing is we have this fixed typo link in our documentation everywhere. And as all of our documentation is written on Markdown on GitHub, they can just correct it with a pull request. So in here, if they see this found a typo, fix it, they just click on the button. It will take them to actually GitHub. And then once they are in GitHub, they just click on edit. They can add whatever they want and then send a PR. And the good thing about that is that then they found a typo, they fixed it. We usually merge it really, really fast, and that's it. It just works because of the CI will send it to our documentation. And again, the cool thing about this is that you can do this same thing that we're doing yourself. If you go to the auth0.com/docs, to github.com/auth0/docs, we will see how we have implemented it. And in there, you will see how we have implemented Markdocs, how we have implemented the Lodash templating, and everything. All I'm saying right now, it's all open source in that project. Another thing that is really important is a complete GitHub README. We are making, besides the product, we are making a lot of open source projects because, I mean, if we are making it for our SDKs, why not just open source it so that everybody can use it? And what we've seen is that there are a lot of open source projects that are not used just because the README sucks. Because let's face it, if you have 3 different libraries and 2 don't have a documentation or README, that means you gotta read the code. And if you have to read the code, it takes a lot of time. So if you have something that has a really cool documentation, then I would use that. And this is what the structure that we have found. This is an Angular storage library that we have. We have always a title, description, key features as you see here, installing it. I will speak a little bit more about this section in a second. Then we have this TLDR using it. Then we have a more advanced usage like namespace storage. And then after that, we have the complete API if somebody wants to do something beyond the basic example. And then we have where is it used, how can you contribute, what is the issue reporting, and what is the license. All of those are actually written here. So title and description, of course. But I think that one of the things that most libraries forget that is really important is these key features. If you can put in 4 lines what is really, really important of your library, that will mean that A, people will say, okay, now I understand why you should use this library instead of the other. Or B, they must say, I don't care about this feature, so fuck it, I won't use it. But at least by just reading those 4 points, in 2 seconds, the guy will know if he's using or not your library. Then after the key features, you should show the person how to install it. If you can have like different ways, better. We always use, for a front-end library, we use like CDN, we use also Bower and NPM. If you don't have a CDN by yourself, you can actually publish it for free in what was the name? I forgot the name. JS Deliver, for example. JS Deliver is the CDN that we are using, and it's actually free to use. You can just submit a PR, and then if you submit a PR with the details of your GitHub repository, each time that you deploy a new version, that version will be automatically deployed to that CDN. So if you want to use it, you should use JS Deliver. It's like really, really good. After installing it, we always have this TLDR. So how to use it in 4 lines so that you can copy, paste, use it. That's it. After that, if somebody wants like a more complete usage, then they can check out the full API. If it's like really, really big, I wouldn't put the full API in the README, but the main methods or the main fields, I would put them there, and then from there, you can link to a full API in the wiki, so as not to make it like so long, the README. Then it's really, really important to have examples, because if you don't have an example and somebody just copy and paste the code, as I was saying, and it doesn't work, it's really hard for him to debug it. But if he has an example that he can run and it works, then it's really easy to copy and paste that example and see why it's working or not. Then, of course, if somebody wants to contribute, you should have some guidelines of how he can contribute, how he should report an issue, or where he should search an issue. Some repositories use Stack Overflow, some use GitHub issues, so clarify it here. And finally, a license. We're always using MIT for our open source projects, but it's really important to put a license, because if you don't put a license, there are a lot of big enterprises that won't be able to use your open source projects, unfortunately, because the lawyers say, no, don't use that. Another thing about documentation is that things should be easy to find, because imagine you're writing like a really, really, really great documentation, but nobody can find it. Then why did you write the documentation if nobody will be able to find it? So for us, we have this quick start where you choose what type of application you're building, like single page app or whatever. If you say I'm building a single page app, you say I'm using it AngularJS, in this case, with Node.js. And then you get automatically the documentation on how to implement it first for AngularJS and then for Node.js. And then this means that we have, I think we have like approximately 50 different documentation pages for each language, for each type. And with this simple wizard in 3 steps and 3 clicks, he got to choose exactly what he needed. So this worked for us, but the important thing is that there should be an easy way so that you can accumulate all the information so that with a couple of clicks, he can get exactly the documentation that he needs. And in our case, what we have done, we have actually copied it from Stripe, is to add a help and support page where you can write there whatever you want to search, and that search will actually search everywhere. It will search in the blog, it will search in the documentation, it will search on GitHub. So whatever in this case says Angular, it will pop up here. So even if the quick start didn't work, he can use this help and support in there. We're using actually an open source library for implementing it, which is like really easy to use. But I forgot to put down the name. But if I will tweet it in after the talk. So look for it because I don't remember. Sorry. Another very important thing is community-driven docs. So in our case, in OutZero, we are like 4 people writing documentation, and 4 people for a library or a product that is used a lot is not that much. So if you can get the community to write docs for you, that's even better. So what we are doing in that case is we have this ask.outzero.com, which is basically a discourse. I don't know if you know the tool, but discourse is an open source project which was created by the Stack Overflow creator. And this is basically a custom Stack Overflow. It works exactly the same as Stack Overflow, but it is for your own product or for your own open source project. You can have tags, responses, you can have badges, etc. And it's open source, so you can just download it and deploy it wherever you want. And the cool thing about it is that whatever question that is put here, then it's like Google searchable. So it's really easy to then search for this information and for somebody else to actually find it. Somebody really great that is doing this is DigitalOcean. They are much better than us at this. And what they are doing is, I don't know if you have heard, but they have a plan where if you want to write an article for DigitalOcean, they pay you $50. And besides paying you $50 to write the article, you get like reputation. So the better you are, you get a bigger reputation. And you have the advantage that most of the articles from DigitalOcean are always first results. So for example, in this case, I had a typo. I realized after taking a screenshot that I had a typo. But in this case, I was searching like how to install Shekel and Nginx. And the first 2 results are from DigitalOcean. And those 2 results from DigitalOcean were actually written by a community person that doesn't work in DigitalOcean. He got paid to write that. He got like self-esteem for writing that. And the good thing is that the documentation that he wrote is on digitalocean.com domain. So when he goes to that page, even though it will say his name and the documentation will be written there, the person will at least know what DigitalOcean is. He might click it, and then it creates more brand awareness. And this is really cool because whatever you search now in the internet of how to install something, you most probably will get a DigitalOcean result. And that's because they have done a really good job on creating community docs. Another thing that we are doing that I think is really important is if your product has an API, you should have an API Explorer. This is like a live sample because an API Explorer means that the user should be able to enter whatever he wants in a website and then just call the API from there. And that way he can get a response from the API, he can see how the request works, and that's really sweet. So let's see it. This used to be our old API. This was tailor-made by us. So if you click on whatever API, you will see what is the request. You click on try me, and in there you get the response. This was tailor-made by us, but now we're actually moving to Swagger. I don't know if you have heard of Swagger, but again, it's an open source project that lets you create the documentation for your API and lets you also create these live documentation pages where you can call the API. In our case, we have all of our backend application made with Node.js. And we started using JSON schema. JSON schema lets you specify what parameters your API call will get, what type, how many, blah, 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 blah. And the good thing about that is that JSON schema lets you automatically create a Swagger file. That Swagger file is a documentation description of your API. And once you have that Swagger file, you can use the Swagger UI project, which will then let you create this website, which is runnable by itself. So in our case, we didn't have to do anything at all to make it working. We just added this JSON schema specifying the fields, and from that, we got the new live page, which I will show now. It's actually in beta, and it's like really ugly, but it works, and it's almost the same. I mean, you have the documentation here, and you will see that once I expand users, you get like all the different things. And once you click, you have all the different parameters, the type, how they work, the different response status types, the different response. And you can click try now to get the response down there, or you can click on curl it up to get like the curl link to call it. And all of this was free. We didn't do anything at all. It is just Swagger UI. And then another important thing is that the documentation should be easy on the eye. As I was saying before, developers don't like to read prose. I hate reading prose. So the documentation for the developers should be really, really, really easy to read and really easy to find the things that you want. So just 3 simple tips is that first, you should use number steps. I don't know why, but when there's number steps, your head is like more ordered, and it's really easy what to do first, what to do then, what to do then, and it's easier to understand what to do. If there are not number steps, it's really hard to understand what's first, what's then, what do I gotta copy, etc. And also, each of these steps should be concise. We don't like reading, so each step should be like install this dependency, run this, do that, and then just very few words, be very concise, and add a lot of code so that they can actually copy-paste that code. So once we started understanding how all of these docs, there were like a lot of things that we had to learn. We were like, wow, this is a lot of information, a lot of things that you gotta learn to actually write documentation for developers. And well, this is what we have right now. So what I'm gonna show you is what's next for Auth0. What are we adding right now? The first thing we're adding is these Trip.js tutorials. What are these? So we're going to create interactive tutorials. The idea is that there are a lot of companies that create like short videos that show how to use like a certain thing. But the reality is that when you read a video, when you see a video, things that you see, I mean, you understand them, but then it's harder to actually repeat that. However, when you're actually doing something, it stays in your brain. For example, it happened to me when I was trying to learn Scala. I read the 1000 book by Martin Odersky about Scala. And then 6 months later, I wanted to code Scala, and I knew shit. I mean, I had to read the whole book again. And that's because I read it, and I didn't do anything. So the basic idea of an interactive tutorial is that it will tell you how to do something, but you gotta do it yourself. And as you do it yourself, it will stay in your brain. So let's see an example. In this page, you click on apps. It goes to all the application. You click on create an app, and it will create a new app. This is just a mock example. And then if you click start tutorial, it will guide you, but it will let you do the thing. So click here to go to the apps page. Click here to create a new app, and then it will say, voila, the application has just been created. So this way, this is a tutorial. The guy is learning how to do it, but he's doing it himself. I researched it for a lot of libraries to do these interactive tutorials, and after trying lots and lots of them, this is the best one that I've found. This is Trip.js. It's really, really configurable. You can do whatever you want. You can blur the screen, not blur, change animations. It's really good, and it's really easy to use. This is what we're going to add next. And even though interactive tutorials are better than video tutorials, we're also going to add video tutorials. So just like a 30, 40 seconds so that they can learn how to do it. If they don't want to follow an interactive tutorial, they can just watch the video. And my question is, then what's next for you to make your documentation better? Because I know we're not doing everything. I know that we have a lot of things to improve. So I would like to know later on from you, what are you doing for your documentation? How are you learning those things? And what do you think a good documentation should be? So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening, or at least pretending to.